Anytime a diver goes underwater for an extended period, he must utilize some means for supplying himself with an atmosphere containing a suitable amount of oxygen. Furthermore, this atmosphere must be provided at a pressure that always balances the pressure exerted by the surrounding water. The deeper the diver goes, the greater the water pressure becomes, and correspondingly, the greater must be the pressure of the atmosphere the diver breathes. This is most essential if the diver is to avoid injury from the mechanical effects of pressure. But breathing air or any other suitable atmosphere at pressures greater than normal, namely 1 atmosphere absolute, exposes the diver to several other potential hazards. For example, narcosis, a kind of intoxication that leaves the diver unable to recognize or cope with danger. Convulsions, a violent loss of muscular control. Unconsciousness, a condition that soon ends in drowning if help is not immediately available. And if this happens, ascending too rapidly, as in a blow-up, it can lead to life-threatening air embolism, or decompression sickness, a condition whose symptoms range from pain to disorders incompatible with life. To help you avoid these hazards, this film will explain how your body is affected by what you breathe and the pressure at which you breathe it. The air we normally breathe exerts an absolute pressure of 1 atmosphere. At this pressure, air supports combustion readily. That is to say, it contains oxygen sufficient in amount not only for burning, but for sustenance of life as well. How much oxygen is in the air can be approximated by this simple experiment. As the burning candle uses up the oxygen within the inverted container, the water rises to take its place. When the flame goes out, the water level reaches the 4/5 mark, proof that about 1/5 of the air is oxygen. The remaining 4/5 of the air's volume is nitrogen. Its absolute pressure is now 1 atmosphere, because the rising water compressed the nitrogen until its pressure equaled that of the outside air. But when this volume of nitrogen fills the entire container, as it did at the start of the experiment, its pressure is only 8/10 of an atmosphere. Since the nitrogen in air exerts a pressure of 8/10 of an atmosphere, and air a pressure of 1 atmosphere, the difference, 2/10 of an atmosphere, is the pressure exerted by oxygen. These values are called partial pressures. These are the symbols for nitrogen and oxygen. The gases in air exert pressure because they are composed of billions upon billions of infinitesimally small particles, called molecules, which are always in motion. Each time a molecule strikes the container, it exerts a force or pressure against it. The pressure we read on this gauge is a measure of the total force exerted by all the molecules that strike the container at any instant. 1/5 of these molecules are oxygen molecules. Therefore, the pressure they exert is 1/5 of the total pressure, or 1/5 times 1 atmosphere, namely 2/10 of an atmosphere. Since 4/5 of the molecules are nitrogen molecules, the pressure they exert is 4/5 of the total pressure. In this instance, 4/5 times 1 atmosphere. That is 8/10 of an atmosphere. From this, you can see that the partial pressure of each gas in air is obtained by taking the part each gas is of the total volume and multiplying it by the total pressure. Now, let's compress the air volume to 1/2, so the total pressure becomes 2 atmospheres, as you would expect from Boyle's law. Since 1/5 of this reduced volume is still oxygen, and 4/5 of it nitrogen, their partial pressures now become 4/10 of an atmosphere and 1 6/10 atmospheres. Changing the total pressure of air, or any other mixture of gases, changes the partial pressure of each gas in the mixture. But here's another way to change the partial pressure of a gas. The number of oxygen molecules is now only 1/10 of the total number, or in other words, its volume is 1/10 of the total volume. Therefore, the partial pressure of oxygen now becomes 1/10 times the total pressure, here 1 atmosphere, for a value of 1/10 of an atmosphere. Breathing oxygen at a partial pressure less than normal, that is, less than 2/10 of an atmosphere, produces certain physiological reactions. This individual has been breathing air which has been slowly depleted of its oxygen content. The oxygen level is now about 10%. In other words, about 1/10 of the air being breathed is oxygen. The individual has a feeling of well-being, which keeps him from realizing the danger he's in. His mental and motor impairment make him act almost as if he were intoxicated. Soon, he loses consciousness and collapses. To understand better why these physiological disturbances occur, let's consider first the effect the partial pressure of oxygen has upon its solubility in blood. Whenever a gas is in contact with a liquid, some of its molecules enter and distribute themselves throughout the liquid until a condition is reached where as many molecules enter the liquid as leave it. When this balance exists, the partial pressure of the gas above the liquid is equal to the partial pressure of the gas dissolved in the liquid. Now, if the partial pressure of the gas above the liquid is increased by doubling the number of its molecules, more gas molecules dissolve into the liquid than leave it. This continues until the partial pressure of the gas within the liquid again equals that of the gas above it. This type of gas exchange takes place all the time within our bodies. The air we breathe, when it reaches the very small air sacs which make up the lungs, contains oxygen, which normally has a partial pressure much greater than the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood carried to the lungs. Therefore, oxygen molecules pass from the air sacs into the blood until the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood, when it leaves the lungs, equals that in the air sacs. The arterial blood, carried to the tissues, such as the brain, has a partial pressure of oxygen greater than that within the tissues. As a result, oxygen passes from the blood into the tissues. But when the atmosphere's partial pressure of oxygen becomes increasingly less than normal, the arterial blood's partial pressure of oxygen also becomes increasingly less. This causes the oxygen partial pressure between the blood and tissues to become less and less with the result that less and less oxygen enters the tissues. The tissues soon become unable to function properly, and those within the brain die within a few minutes. This will happen to this individual if the air he is breathing is not restored to its normal content of oxygen. Under normal conditions, the air you inhale has an oxygen content of about 20%, which is equivalent to a partial pressure of 0.2 of an atmosphere. The air you exhale has an oxygen content of 16%, which means that any time you inhale air with an oxygen content less than 16%, that is to say, a partial pressure of 16/100ths or less, you are in serious trouble, which, if not corrected quickly, will cause death. Now, let's observe the effect of breathing air in which the partial pressure of oxygen is considerably higher than normal. The individual on whom this demonstration is being performed has agreed to this exposure. He is restrained from excessive movement in order to keep him from injuring himself. After 15 minutes of breathing oxygen at a partial pressure of 4 atmospheres absolute, the individual manifests involuntary localized muscular twitching, such as in the eyes and hands. This soon becomes generalized. Finally, the victim becomes convulsive, a condition which, if it occurs underwater, is almost certain to end fatally. From tests such as this, and others conducted by the experimental diving unit, it has been established that the average diver during working dives should not breathe oxygen at a partial pressure of 2 atmospheres for more than 30 minutes. Since individuals vary greatly in their susceptibility to oxygen poisoning, all diving candidates must demonstrate their ability to breathe pure oxygen within the established safe time depth limits. Any unusual symptom, such as nausea, anxiety, restlessness, dizziness, or muscular twitching, is a telltale indication of oxygen poisoning and calls for an immediate reduction in the partial pressure of oxygen. You will recall that as you descend, the pressure of your air supply must increase by 1 atmosphere for each 33 feet of descent. This is essential if you are to avoid the harmful mechanical effects of pressure. Thus, the absolute pressure at 33 feet is 2 atmospheres. At 66 feet, 3 atmospheres, and so on. The partial pressures of oxygen at these depths increase correspondingly by 0.2 of an atmosphere, since 1/5 of the total pressure is due to the oxygen molecules. The partial pressure of oxygen established as the safety limit for Navy divers breathing air is reached at 297 feet. But well before this depth is reached, the diver is subjected to another danger. Intoxication or narcosis by nitrogen at high partial pressure in the air being breathed. The effects of breathing nitrogen at a high partial pressure can be demonstrated more clearly in this recompression chamber. This man is breathing air at an absolute pressure of 10 atmospheres, attained at a depth of 297 feet. Notice how erratic and unsure his actions are. He appears sleepy and not too interested or concerned with the problem at hand. This man, on the other hand, also at 10 atmospheres absolute, is breathing a helium oxymixture. Substituting helium for nitrogen in the breathing medium minimizes or eliminates the narcotic reactions noted when air is breathed at pressures above 4 atmospheres. To avoid the hazards of nitrogen narcosis, special equipment has been designed to supply a helium-oxygen breathing medium to divers descending to depths where the absolute pressure is considerably greater than 7 atmospheres. But regardless of whether the diver breathes an oxygen-helium mixture or compressed air, the nitrogen or helium in the breathing medium can cause trouble in another way. When you breathe air under normal conditions, that is, at a pressure of 1 atmosphere, the nitrogen that enters your lungs is at a partial pressure of 8/10 of an atmosphere. Within the lungs, the nitrogen in the air sacs is at the same partial pressure as the nitrogen in the blood entering the lungs. As a result, the blood leaving the lungs receives no additional nitrogen. When this blood reaches the tissues, such as the brain, its partial pressure of nitrogen also equals that in the tissues. Consequently, no additional nitrogen enters the tissues. But if the diver breathes air at a pressure greater than 1 atmosphere, the partial pressure of nitrogen in the air sacs increases. This causes the blood leaving the lungs to contain more nitrogen, which eventually causes the tissues to contain more nitrogen. With each increase of air pressure, a considerable period of time is required for the blood to raise the partial pressure of nitrogen in all the tissues to that in the air sacs. Now, if the air being breathed decreases in pressure, the process is reversed. Nitrogen passes from the blood into the air sacs and is exhaled. This blood, in turn, receives more nitrogen from the tissues and carries it to the air sacs, where it is released and exhaled. This process continues until the partial pressure of nitrogen in all the tissues equals that of the air sacs. The rate of ascent determines the rate at which the nitrogen dissolved in the tissues and blood is released. This can be demonstrated by a simple experiment. The liquid flowing over the glass beads has been exposed to nitrogen under pressure until the pressure of its dissolved nitrogen equals the pressure of the surrounding atmosphere of nitrogen. Decreasing the pressure of the surrounding atmosphere of nitrogen slowly, that is to say, a slow rate of ascent, the nitrogen dissolved in the liquid enters the surrounding atmosphere without any visible evidence of its release. But when the rate of ascent is fast, notice the bubbles of nitrogen that form in the liquid before escaping to the atmosphere. Here is further evidence of the formation of these nitrogen bubbles in the blood of a frog, which has been rapidly decompressed. Notice how these bubbles in the blood vessel can block the flow of blood. The formation of such bubbles of nitrogen in any of the body's tissues or blood is known as decompression sickness. These bubbles interfere with the blood circulation as well as press upon nerves. Decompression sickness occurs whenever the ascent is too rapid. The symptoms of decompression sickness may range from pain in the arms and legs to collapse with unconsciousness. Decompression sickness is a most serious condition that requires immediate care to prevent permanent damage and perhaps death. Another source of difficulty to the diver is the accumulation within the tissues of carbon dioxide, a natural product of body metabolism. By breathing, the body rids itself of its excess carbon dioxide. Under normal conditions of rest, the air we exhale contains about 4% of carbon dioxide, here represented by the peaks on the right. The values on the left represent the percent of carbon dioxide in the air being inhaled, which under normal conditions is negligible in amount and of no real concern to the diver. But if the exhaled air with its excess of carbon dioxide should become a part of the inhaled air, the percent of carbon dioxide in the inhaled air rises, causing more carbon dioxide to accumulate within the tissues. The body reacts by breathing faster and deeper in order to rid itself of the extra carbon dioxide. This is a visual record of the subject's respiratory movements. First, breathing normal air, in which the carbon dioxide content is negligible, and then air in which the carbon dioxide content is increasing. When the inhaled air contains about 6% of carbon dioxide, the breathing becomes noticeably labored. The subject is really in distress as his body hungers for more and more good air with which to flush out the accumulated carbon dioxide. The toxic effect of too much carbon dioxide is eventually unconsciousness. Unconsciousness usually results when the inhaled air contains 10% or more of carbon dioxide. 10% of carbon dioxide at the surface or at 1 atmosphere absolute has a partial pressure of 1/10 of an atmosphere. This value, which produces unconsciousness, can also be obtained from breathing air with only 1% of carbon dioxide at an absolute pressure of 10 atmospheres. Therefore, to avoid carbon dioxide poisoning when diving with the Navy standard dress, the diver, as he descends, must continually increase the rate of flow of air through his suit, so that the percent of carbon dioxide in his inhaled air will decrease as the absolute pressure increases. And in using closed-circuit scuba gear, in which the diver's exhaled air becomes part of his inhaled air, it is imperative that the equipment remove all the carbon dioxide from the exhaled air. The carbon dioxide absorption canister must be watertight and its absorbent crystals unexhausted. They should be dry and pink or white, never blue. In review, it is important for every diver to understand how his body is affected by what he breathes and the pressure at which he breathes it. For example, breathing oxygen at a partial pressure considerably less than 2/10 of an atmosphere results in mental and muscular impairment, and finally, collapse and unconsciousness. While, on the other hand, Breathing oxygen at a partial pressure considerably greater than normal leads to convulsions, a condition marked by violent loss of muscular control. Breathing air at pressures greater than 4 atmospheres exposes the diver to nitrogen narcosis, a condition that leaves the diver unable to work safely or to think effectively. Divers exposed to great pressures for considerable periods of time must remember to ascend slowly. Otherwise, they run the risk of falling victim to decompression sickness, a condition in which bubbles of nitrogen or helium form within the tissues and blood to produce symptoms which range from pain to collapse and unconsciousness. Divers are also subject to carbon dioxide poisoning if their breathing medium contains carbon dioxide in amounts appreciably greater than normal. With carbon dioxide poisoning, breathing becomes labored and, if severe, will cause unconsciousness. Diving, whether it be with scuba or the Navy standard dress, is safe when you not only know the Navy's rules for safe diving, but even more important, when you understand why they have been established. By following these rules intelligently, every diver can avoid the harmful effects of pressure, both mechanical and physiological.